Hamidakiopi, Gabrielle Tateyuskanskan. I'm a member of the Oak Lake Riders, and we're going to discuss with Kate Beane one of the selections of the one book, Charles Eastman's work, Soul of an Indian. And I've been a longtime member of the Oak Lake Writers Organization, and I'll let Kate Beane introduce herself.
Hamitakepi, Kate Beane and Akiapie. Hello, my relatives. My name is Kate Beane. I am Director of Native American Initiatives at the Minnesota Historical Society and a public historian living in Minneapolis in Breota, Minnesota. Happy to be here today.
Okay, Kate, let's start with some of the activities that you did surrounding your research to do the film on Charles Eastman and how it relates to Soul of an Indian.
Yeah, so my grandmother Lillian Moore Bean was a granddaughter of John Eastman, Charles Eastman's brother. And so I grew up hearing a lot of stories about our grandparents and it was interesting when I went to college and started reading some of Grandpa Charles' books and the ways in which sometimes he was talked about and written about was very different than the stories that were passed down as just a person, as a human being. And I felt like there was this stark difference. And so I started researching more around his life in order to understand the lives of our family members and the ways in which we are connected, disconnected over time, and just trying to understand where I come from and where my family comes from, so that I would know our family story and understand it as best that I could. And so part of that led to doing research, which my father is a community organizer. He was trained by Saul Alinsky out of Chicago, and he retired. And when he retired, he became a filmmaker. He's retired 3 times and picked up new jobs along the way. And so he became a filmmaker, and he started making a documentary about our grandfather. And then he kind of tricked me. He turned the camera on me doing research, and ended up the documentary, which initially I thought I was doing research for, just a talking heads documentary about our grandfather. And that maybe my name might be in a credit for doing research. And instead, my dad turned the camera on me and kind of took on a life of its own.
One of the things you mentioned is, being a family member, as I am also. Did you think that there was a stigma in his time for being Dakota and being educated by the larger society? And then how do you think he was viewed as an educated person in his own community?
Certainly. And I think that that's also what makes him so relatable for a lot of Native students. When we read his works in college, and I read his work and studied with a professor by the name of David Martinez out of Arizona, and who's Tohono O'odham. And I think that one of the things that we used to talk a lot about was the impact that Grandpa Charles' writings had on young Native students. Being away from home, or that stigma of being book smart versus being raised in your community, and what the different teachings, the oral storytelling versus reading some of these stories, and the ways in which Grandpa Charles' work really affected me is that all of these things began to sort of become interwoven. Because for us as Dakota people who were removed from our ancestral homeland into other areas, some stories were passed down and some stories weren't. And with Grandpa Charles, some of the stuff that he wrote down was sort of that oral storytelling for us, and it was a way of remembering. And I just remember reading his work and just knowing, really remembering what it felt. I knew how it felt to be the only Native in the classroom. And so, when I was in college, I ended up becoming a Charles Eastman Fellow at Dartmouth College. And I think I was the first in our family to take that fellowship under his name. And I remember sitting there in the library and just looking around and just feeling this closeness with him, because I understood how it felt to be away from my family. I understood how it felt to be in this weird Eastern society. Hanover, New Hampshire is an odd place, and it doesn't feel like a very welcoming place as a Native student. And thinking about the ways in which he dealt with that back in his own time period when things were even more difficult gave me strength. And I think there was a lot that we can learn from it.
And then I think there was a stigma about, as you mentioned, about being educated. I can remember my mother talking about that. She heard adult comments like, don't go to the Washichu doctor at IHS because
Yeah.
they'll cut you with a knife and give you cancer. And
Yeah.
so I think among Dakota people, I think there's evidence of comments I heard growing up that people made about his character, that he continued to speak the Dakota language in the old
Yeah.
dialect, and he practiced traditions with community people. He went to Canada to live in the old traditions with his son,
Mm-hmm.
and so I think although he was educated, I think community people had a different perspective of him, and
Yeah.
I can remember people calling him Charlie instead of Charles.
Yeah. And he never pretended to be anyone other than who he was. I think that when I remember some of the stories that my grandma told me about that she heard from her mother Grace, who used to go and stay with him and Elaine, um, he was just this very sort of, he was a community guy, and I feel like over the years, the way biographers have written about him, they wrote about him as if he somehow left his Dakota family and left his roots and became assimilated. And that was so not who he was. I mean, we still have family letters from him back in, that communication still happened. And he was still very much a part of his Dakota family, even though he moved out east, because he had a family to support. And that's the other thing, is that some of the challenges he had in his life are challenges that a lot of us face and really withstand, through time.
And as a member of the Eastman family, I also heard community people talking about him, but we had the advantage of having his books in our home. I think I read Wigwam Evenings and Indian Boyhood. I might have been in the fifth grade. And so we had access to his works, and we knew it was possible to be a professional person.
Yeah.
And so, how did that influence your decisions and the activism and the choices you made in your life?
Well, I think I remember my dad giving me a copy of Indian Boyhood when I was like 10, and telling me, here, read this. He also gave me a copy of Rules for Radicals, but that's just my dad. Um, and I think my dad grew up on a reservation in Flandreau. He knew the struggles of what it was like trying to retain your Indianness while making your way through the society that made it difficult to really be yourself as a Native person, and as somebody who um, was invested in education. He wanted me to love education as much as he did, and I didn't when I was younger. I left school when I was 15. I dropped out. I didn't feel like it was a place for me, and um, I felt like I wasn't welcome. And in reading our grandfather's works, it was interesting how when I reread his works in college, when I went back to school after years of sort of living on my own, I went back to school in my 20s. And when I read his work, it had an entirely different meaning for me. Like I related to it in a way that I didn't before. And it had such an impact because all of a sudden I understood the things he was saying that I didn't really understand when I was young because I had started to live a bit more. Um, and so it's interesting. I definitely recommend, and, I know reading his works at different parts in our lives because they're going to have different meanings at different times.
Right. And so, how do you think the works of, his writing and his activism, how do you think it helped society and readers understand the systematic racism in America?
I think the work that he was doing is he was essentially trying to help the world understand and see humanity and understand and see the fact. I mean, he was living during a time period, obviously, where, people saw our people as animals. We weren't even seen as human. And he was trying to show the goodness of what it meant to be Dakota. The ways in which, and from in the Soul of an Indian, he talks about the superiority of the Dakota lifeway and how we are so misunderstood. And I think what he's really trying to get across to people basically is just this fundamental sense of we matter too. And we're important and our lifeways are important and they always have been. And but it's this it's sort of this back and forth between how reconcilable can we still exist in this society that's constantly changing us and the struggle. I think it's an ongoing problem. His work is still, a lot of the things he talks about are things we're still struggling with today, and that's what makes it so relatable. And yet at the same time, you can learn a lot by the ways in which he wrote about things during a time period when there was even more stigma, you know.
Right.
When Soul of the Indian opens, there's that one statement where he says the religion of the Indian is the last thing about him that the man of another race will ever understand. And that's just such a powerful statement, And this is said by somebody who was Christian, and I think for people to understand the complexity of history, they have to understand that and learn to think beyond binaries. And I think that's what he was really trying to do.
Yes, I think it's real important that um, the larger world sees and is able to look at that there is a deep inner life of Dakota people. And I
Mm-hmm.
think as the artist or a writer, that's the role of those persons to examine deeply human activity and then take a critical look and then look even deeper again. And how do you think Charles happened to do this?
I think he did it through thinking about the teachings. He was a real deep thinker, and he would take the teachings that he had growing up, and he knew how to relate, how to explain these teachings to a way for another people coming from a different background could understand them, which is a true gift. And I think that definitely the support of Elaine as an editor was always helpful in terms of sometimes you can see the sort of flowery writing that she contributed to, but the stories were all his, and the gift
Right.
for storytelling were all his, and the messages are all his, and he had such a gift for, and I think when you look at old newspaper articles and look at all of the talks that he would give, I mean, he traveled around the world lecturing, and he was somebody that would make people take note and they wanted to hear more. I mean, he was just a very magnetic individual, and he had a way with words, and he had a way with people.
And then when you look at his career as a medical professional, um, how do you think society promoted or didn't promote a Dakota person being a professional at that time?
I think that's something that he always struggled with, and despite what people may believe, he was never a wealthy individual. He was never, he always struggled to help support his family. And here's a man who went from speaking only Dakota in a very short time, earning a medical degree, going to a prestigious, getting this prestigious education, and then he wanted to be a healer. He wanted to heal his people, but he knew he wasn't a medicine man. His grandmother had raised him with certain teachings, and he wasn't going to pretend to be anyone that he truly wasn't. And he wanted to combine these different ways of doctoring in order to help his people. But when he received his medical degree and he moved to St. Paul and tried to open an office, people wouldn't go to see him because he was Native, because he was Dakota in Minnesota, and so he couldn't even get people to come to him. And really, what he was most interested in was helping his own people. And he ended up at Pine Ridge Agency, but then he was somebody that was never going to turn a blind eye when he saw corruption, when he saw his people, his own relatives being exploited and taken advantage of. And he called a lot of that out, and he faced consequences for that professionally. And I think that we see that at time and time again in his life, where he was an incredibly intelligent person who saw what was happening around him. And he knew that if he wrote about it, that there was a strategic way in which he could write about it that could get people to listen. And he spoke the truth, and he tried his best to do that. But it was also at his own sort of peril, because he had a large family to support, and oftentimes he risked those jobs in speaking the truth.
What do you think his role was for the Dakota communities he worked in?
Well, I think early on his role was as a medical doctor, and he, even later in life, he always took his physician's bag with him, and so he continued to practice and share his what he knew, and the ways in which he could help his people in that way. But I think later on, I mean, it's one of those things too where you help where you can. And I think later on, when you look at the ways in which he helped with the creation of the different reservation chapters with the YMCA, the work he did with the Boy Scouts of America, there was a lot of different jobs that he took on where he was essentially trying to advocate for healthy living. When you look at those early YMCA chapters, they were really advocating for healthy living because they saw the ways in which alcohol was having such a bad effect in communities. And he wanted to help his people remember these healthy teachings, and these ways, these values that he had been taught at a young age, because he saw the ways in which some of those teachings were being I don't want to say lost, because they were still there and they are still there today, but because of the barriers that were put into place because of colonization, our access to these traditional teachings and ways of life and our language, all of it was becoming harder.
So, do you think he did improve the lives of tribal people in those communities?
Certainly. I think, he he didn't just write for a white audience. He didn't just work for a white audience. He lobbied for funding for communities. He lobbied for citizenship. He lobbied for things that would help his people. And he worked a lot with people in the community, even when he didn't live on the reservation, and even when he lived on the East Coast. There's a lot of documentation in the archives. There's a lot of letters that we see where he communicated directly with and stayed in very close connection with people who were on the ground doing that work. And he spent a lot of time traveling from reservation to reservation. And it was interesting too, because when you read his work, he traveled to Ojibwe country, which historically our people would battle when he was growing up as a young boy. And here he got this whole other perspective of this community in this different way. And so it's almost like he had this sort of window into the world that no one else really had at that time.
You know, being a doctor at Pine Ridge during the Wounded Knee Massacre and fleeing Minnesota during the Dakota conflict, do you think he suffered traumatic scars because of his experiences and because he was intelligent and he knew what was happening?
Yeah, I mean, when you think about the stories that he told over and over again in some of his works, I always wonder, like, what did he write that was edited out, that wasn't deemed appropriate, or that the stories
Society,
that he yeah,
yeah,
the stories that he did share, though, were the stories of, like, his grandmother carrying him on her back across the river, around through this icy cold river. And he talked about the strength of the women in our society over and over again. And he talked about people as true human beings who had to make difficult choices, and who sometimes did things that you know were troubling, but who also went out, did everything they could to just ensure that their people would survive. He was a very honest individual.
and
And
then and then I reflect on some of the things that he said in Soul of an Indian that
mhm,
you could tell that his rich inner life was really important to, as you said, because he promoted health to being a healthy person.
yeah, certainly. And he talks about the early missionaries, and he talks about this truth too around 1862. um, he talks about the ways in which not a lot of our people didn't convert to Christianity until after that war. And so he tries to tell the history of Christian conversion within our communities, as well as the history of sort of not our traditional ways of thinking paired with and relationship to Christianity, in a way that is really, really complex. But he uses, I know that when some people have talked about his work, they've said that he wrote very simple, which I don't see at all. I see his works as being very complex, very sort of theoretical. And you can read a sentence three times, and you can read three different things out of it. It's just really beautiful.
Do you think he improved the lives of his family and relatives, like especially coming out of 1862? That I know his older sister Mary was a prisoner at Fort
Mm-hmm.
Snelling and then later at Crow Creek, and how that must have felt to be a professional person and be doing activism, and yet the very things you're trying to correct, your family members and yourself are experiencing those harms.
Yeah, I mean, there's no doubt. I don't know how anybody could have that not affect them. I mean, um, our grandfather John wrote a letter to their grandfather when he was in prison. He was just a boy with his little brother David Hipon, um, and just knowing that this history of what his older brothers and sisters went through, and understanding that his personal experience was a bit different. He definitely, um, in a sense, was sheltered because he was the youngest. I think he was protected by the rest of the family at first through some of this time period, but there was no getting away from it. He still saw what happened. And when he explains in his work what he saw during that war period, he explains it through a child's eye, which I think is really brilliant in a lot of ways, because that helps people to see the humanity in that experience, because they don't often think about the war period through the eyes of children.
And then he worked with, non-Indian young people, but I always wondered why he wasn't able to develop the minds and bodies of young people in reservation communities to have the same kind of camps that he had for non-Indian young people, why those things didn't happen in reservation communities.
I don't know. I think that's a good question. I think that, some of the camps that he was working with on the East Coast, where there was direct involvement of his kids and sort of where they were living. I do think, and just doing some of my research in the ways in which he worked with the YMCA and helped with encouraging basketball in reservation communities. I think that history is a history that hasn't been fully documented as well as it could be, because it's a really interesting story. He I can't remember what his name is, but there's an individual who essentially created basketball, and they worked together to help bring basketball to Native reservation communities. And again, it was this way of encouraging healthy living and trying to encourage and trying to empower young people to remember who they are as Dakota men and women.
What are some of your favorite passages from Soul of an Indian?
Um, some of my favorite passages, I would say. Let's see if I can. I have a copy right here, and I had written down a passage, and then I forgot my paper when I came and sat down. So I'm gonna find it really quick. Um, but part of it is, I love the ways in which he talks about the Bible and how our oral histories and our oral storytelling and our traditions and our teachings are like a living Bible. And the ways in which he explains that living Bible, I think, is really, really beautiful. Um, I like when he says, oh, where is it? Well, there's the quote that I already said about just some of his teachings. He says, it was not until his spirit was broken and his moral and physical constitution undermined by trade, conquest, and strong drink that Christian missionaries obtained any real hold upon him. Strange as it may seem, it is true that the proud pagan in his secret soul despised the good men who came to convert and to enlighten him. I think the ways in which he talks about conversion, Christian conversion in our communities, and the ways in which, it wasn't this like polarizing opposite of who we are as Indigenous people, but really our relationship to these ways of thinking and being able to relate to some of the values that I really find powerful, because I wasn't there. I didn't walk during that time period. I didn't experience what it was like. And so over time, I think the way that it's been often written about is, that you have this binary of traditional people versus those who didn't follow our ways and converted and became assimilated. And here you read his work and you realize it's much more complicated than that.
Yes. And I often think that um, when Dakota people were incarcerated in the prison camp and
Mm-hmm.
his older sister was there, and when the very times when you have fear and you belong to a sovereign nation, but yet another nation is imprisoning you and then taking away your spirituality, the one consolation that you would think human beings would need during really difficult times. Um, Bishop Whipple comes in and,
Yeah.
convinces people to burn their spiritual accoutrements. And
Yeah.
I think he really gives a good window in Soul of an Indian of why that inner life and why ceremonial life was so important to Dakota people.
Mm-hmm.
And then to look at what was happening at that time, um, you just wonder, some of those events should have been unsurvivable, but yet they resisted and did survive. And I think he
Yeah.
was really good at pointing out some of those things about, like how you mentioned before, he was always talking about how strong the women in his life were.
Yeah. And it's interesting too to think about, people talk about being traditional, and how far back does all of a sudden this tradition start, and how are those things, how tradition is something that's living and sometimes even changes over time. He talks about, here's a quote where he says, during the era of Reconstruction, they modified their customs and beliefs continually, creating a singular admixture of Christian with pagan superstitions and an addition to the old folklore of disguised Bible stories under an Indian aspect. Even their music shows the influence of the Catholic chants. Most of the material collected by modern observers is necessarily of this promiscuous character. And I think that's what's really interesting about that is thinking about the ways in which we, certain ways and songs and teachings and stories have been influenced, and how we shouldn't feel ashamed of some of these traditions that we grew up with. And I say that as somebody who grew up going to the First Presbyterian Church in Flandreau, and my grandmother would always sing Dakota hymns with us. And to me, that is tradition too. And I love hearing those old hymnals. They give me a sense of peace. And I feel like, as a Dakota person living in the city, what I often hear is people saying that that was wrong, and that we shouldn't be singing those hymns. And to me, it's like, I'm never going to tell my grandmother that she was wrong for believing in something that gave her peace, considering what a difficult life she lived through. And she was a very happy person. And those hymnals gave us they also kept our language safe in a lot of ways. I interviewed and Super Labatt, uh, out of who lives in Upper Sioux. I interviewed him about Dakota hymnals for an exhibit that we did at my work. And it was pointed out by somebody who was recording our interview that we both use the word safe when we talk about hymnals in the church, as a way that this was where our language was kept safe. Because growing up, it was the only place I heard my language. I never heard my grandmother speak it. She couldn't physically speak it, but she could sing it. And that's a really powerful thing. And I don't want to ever give up the goodness of that.
Right. What do you think his relationship to his immediate family members? I know, in like my family, my brother was influenced to become a medical doctor, and he did, and then he went on to become uh, both a child and adult psychiatrist.
Mm-hmm.
And I know he influenced me that I could be more than one thing. I could, because he was a physician and an author. Mine
Mm-hmm.
was still in the arts. I could be a visual artist and I could be a writer too. So, how do you
Yeah.
think his relationship and his influence was on his immediate family members?
I think that has definitely been a heavy focus on education, in all the different sides of the family. And you see it. There's so many of us who have gone on to graduate school, who have looked at education and all the frustrations that come with education. We've been able to persevere because we have this family dynamic that tells us that there's a greater purpose for us, and that we have to learn how to navigate this system in order to help others. And I think that it's ingrained in us to help our community. And what I see with him too is that he kept a very close connection with multiple sides of his family, with all of his brothers and his sister. And when some of us have started to meet over the years, and some of us kept in touch, and others not as well, but we all have this commitment to helping our community and helping our people. And I think one of the things that he really inspired me with is, like you said, the fact that you could be more than one thing. For me, it was that understanding that you could really think about what is it that you can contribute, what can you offer. I was trained as a public historian, but I work in a museum, and I also used to have had a wide variety of different jobs, and using those skills that you have in different ways and figuring out how to transfer those skills to other places has been, I think, for me, one of the things that I was really inspired by watching him. He wasn't afraid to change career paths. He just wanted to help his people.
Right. Um, Another thing that I often wonder about is, that the family narratives, that he's a different person than, the public persona of who he is.
Mm-hmm.
And what happens when you make those deep commitments to activism, and that doesn't necessarily mean that you're immune to feeling racism yourself, or um, having to navigate racism and the trauma that can put on a person when they're committed to improving society, but there's also a toll that trauma plays in place.
Yeah, certainly.
And
I
so I
think,
know, well, I was going to add that I know, you know, both our families have done a lot of activism. Like I was the co-coordinator that started the Women's Commemorative March, and then you and your sister and your father were a part of changing the place name for Lake Calhoun.
mhm,
And I think a lot of non-Indian people don't understand why those changes are so important, and
yeah,
even though they're hard to do.
they are. I don't know. Sometimes I don't know that people really see how hard it is to do, the amount of time it takes, and also the amount of backlash that you get. I know you
Right,
and I have talked about that at times. I mean, our family got hate mail, um, and it can be daunting. It can be scary. We still live in a time where white supremacy and issues of backlash, settler backlash, is still very real. And it's getting better. Sometimes it seems like it's not, but it is. But it's one of those things where I think my dad had mentioned before, where it's kind of like you have to sacrifice yourself to the cause in order
right,
to make that, to push that needle, and it is really hard. At the same time, I do feel, at least in listening to my dad speak, and reading Charles' work, he talks about how when you become a certain age in your life, it's the happiest period of your life. I think he says in The Soul of the Indian that a lot of the burdens from being young are gone, and you're able to speak your mind. And my dad's living in that moment right now, where
right.
he feels like he can say anything he wants to because he's earned it.
He's
And
the elder now.
he's elder, yeah. And so I love talking with him because I feel there's just so much wisdom. Oftentimes he'll say things that I don't. I mean, I'm in my 40s, so I don't always understand yet what he's trying to tell me if we disagree about something. But I also know enough and was raised to know that, okay, I don't know this yet. Um, I need to remember that I haven't gotten that far in life yet, and to know, and I have respect enough for my dad to know that what he says comes from teachings that I just haven't gotten yet.
Right. But I think the real important quality is, if you're going to do activism, to really have family support.
Yeah.
And I think Charles had that um, in his relatives' belief that he was doing the right thing for Dakota people.
Yeah.
And I think the larger society still doesn't quite get it. They don't understand the difference between um, truth telling of a dark and difficult history and commemorating somebody who's a part of that. And that's why the place name Calhoun should have been changed. That's why people want to see statues taken down. They're not saying the dark and difficult history shouldn't be looked at and discussed, but society should not commemorate those individuals. And I
Yeah.
think that's some of the backlash I think that Charles experienced in his professional work and as a writer and an artist, is that it's still taking society a long time to admit that the foundation of this country was, you know, based on the mistreatment of Native Americans and theft of their homeland, the ruin of their sovereign nations, and then bringing Black people from their homelands so that they could have wealth. And so they stole the wealth of Native people and stole the wealth, labor of Africans and other people that they brought to this country. And I think that's so hard to tell that difficult story and the truth of the damage it has caused in this country without, experiencing backlash from people that just don't want to hear it.
Yeah, and I think that it's also important to think about how hard it is to work for these changes within oppressive systems. And Grandpa Charles, I mean, he when he went to DC, when he was working when he worked with government, he was in the midst of these oppressive systems that were created to ensure that we weren't going to survive. And yet here he was chipping away from the inside, trying to create change. And I think we're still dealing with that today. I know I definitely can relate working for a large public organization, where those of us who work from the inside trying to create change sometimes get another kind of backlash from people stating, how can you work there? How can you uh, dare to work from the inside? There's this idea that you can only work from the inside or the outside. And the way that I was taught is we have to be everywhere and we have to do it from all sides together at the same time. And I think that's what the way that Charles felt as well. Um, because we have to have a seat at the table where decisions are getting made, but we also have to push and we have to be everywhere. And we're still
Right.
struggling with that.
And there's roles for everybody to participate. There's so
Yeah.
many things to do.
And everybody has their own skill sets and helping to contribute to these changes. And we just have to figure out ways in order to do it um, from all sides together and acknowledge the work of others.
So towards the end of his career, um, that he experienced many hardships as he became an elder. I don't really see that society gave him uh, really understood what he went through in his lifetime to create change in society. And I
Mm-hmm.
think it seemed like he became a very tired man towards the end of his life because he had battled so hard and through extraordinary barriers that if you think of somebody that their first language was Dakota and then they end up at Dartmouth College,
Yeah.
that was, it showed how intelligent he was, but also how determined and how hard he had to work.
Yeah. Well, and it's interesting in reading his work with each book, depending on the time period when it was written, you can start to see sort of the ways in which his own thinking sort of shifted over time too.
Mm-hmm.
And towards the end of his life, he very much became focused on living back in the country and simple living and fishing and and the photographs that I've seen that family members have of that time period of his life, towards the very end, he was actually quite happy because he had kind of separated himself and gone back to the land. And that's where he wanted to be. And I think that for a long part of his life, he struggled in trying to he kind of sacrificed himself to help other people understand why that way of living was so important for our people. And I think he took himself out of it for too long. And then eventually he had to kind of go home and realize he had to take care of himself and his family.
Right. And I think that's one of the things that the culture is really good at doing in the ceremonial life. Our sacred sites are, across the prairie, and you have to know what they are to be able to identify where they are. But I think that was a real important point he made in The Soul of an Indian, is how important the Dakota landscape is
Mm-hmm.
to the heart of Dakota people. And, people are poetic about saying, like the drum is the heartbeat of the people or of the earth. But it truly is if you understand how deep those connections are. And I think you're right that that's why he ended up having to live in the country again, because it was the same as what he knew as a boy,
Mm-hmm.
living on the landscape.
The way he talks about silence and how important silence and just being in nature is for your spirit. As a Lakota person living in the city, I miss that so much. My husband was born and raised in Pine Ridge, and we struggle all the time living in the city. And my work is here, my job is here, but my heart, is somewhere else. But at the same time, it's here because this is where our people are from. And so trying to reconcile that, it's something that we all still, I think, struggle with in a lot of ways.
I think, yeah, and I think if people understood that in Minneapolis, like you could look at the lakes, and that's where Cloudman's village
Mhm.
was, and there's all these sites that are important family history, and yet they're important history of Minnesota and the people there. But I think people just don't understand, how for our homeland, even the sites in Minneapolis have real importance to Dakota people.
Yeah.
The site at what's called Badote today, and I think they misinterpret terms too. That Badote means a geographical description of two rivers that converge. It's
Yeah.
became a site name, but that it's a word that has geographical meaning, and um, people misunderstand why Dakota people want to keep those place names intact.
Yeah, the teachings that come with it. And I think a lot of people don't realize too that we're still fighting to keep roads from going through our cemeteries here in
Right.
the city. It's an everyday battle. And so we have to be here to fight it, but it's still it's difficult considering how much it's changed here over the years.
Yes.
But we're making some good progress too.
I think so, and I think what's really good is there are allies in society now, and there's a generation of young people from all kinds of backgrounds that see the importance of social change. They're
Yeah,
open to learning. Um, they want to promote humanitarian efforts,
yeah,
and they want to have dialogue. It's not that, um, especially in some farming communities, there's still friction about how settlers got their land. And
yeah,
especially for people who have been in farming for generations, it's just hard for them to admit that, you farmed stolen land and
yeah,
benefited from it for years. And
yeah.
but I think it's probably going to take another couple generations for a lot of more progressive change to happen. But to me, it's really good to see that the activism that's happening, and it might be scary in Minneapolis right now with people showing their rage and frustration. But to me, the next step is dialogue and policy changes, which seem to be happening.
Yeah, and people when it comes to direct action, that is a necessary piece of the story, and people are tired of words. They want to see actual change take place. They want to see policy change, like you said. And I think that one of the things that I'm really inspired by my grandfather Charles and the ways in which he inspired my own grandmother were to think positively. That value of positivity is something that it's the hardest thing. It is so hard to stay positive sometimes. I mean, my neighborhood was burning down 2 weeks ago, and it was a really difficult experience to go through. And yet, when the smoke cleared, and I took my two young daughters down there, and I talked to them, and I explained to them what had happened and why, the ways in which they were so resilient, and the things that came out of their mouths, the teachings that they had for me, really let me know that we were going to be okay. And I feel like it's that positive outlook on the future. I don't have I don't feel like I have any space for negativity in my life, simply because the only way to move forward, you have to be hopeful, or else you're never going to get there. But it's
Yes,
hard.
yeah. Yes, I think so. I think activism is hard, and you have to have a good support system. And that's why I brought up, like what was Charles' relationship to his family and his immediate family and to the Dakota communities, because I think that's where a lot of your inner strength comes from. That, when you can't stand alone, then your family helps bring that
Yeah,
strength to help you keep on standing.
yeah, it really does. And you remember the strength of everything that they lived through, and it's just I'm always in awe when I look over the things that he accomplished in his lifetime. You know, I'm so proud.
Is there anything else that you would like to add about, the soul of an Indian, or anything else related to Charles?
Well, I think one of the things I always remember about Soul of the Indian is when I was in college, we read a lot of Bind Deloria Jr. And I remember hearing in a classroom that teacher said that he had like top three books that he recommended that everyone read, and that Soul of the Indian was one of his top three. And I always thought that was kind of cool. Um, but there's just the teachings in it are so personal and so important, but it's done in a way that isn't isn't preachy, and that's exactly what he talks about in the work too. Figuring out, trying to learn how to have a strong sense of spirituality and a strong sense of self um, without being preachy to others, and understanding the ways in which a lot of that lives within yourself is, I think, really powerful, and helps us to learn how to navigate and live in whatever society we choose to live in. Just a lot of great teachings in there, and I think everybody should read it.
Yes, I agree. Well, I really want to thank you for agreeing to have this dialogue about Charles Eastman's book, The Soul of an Indian. And I thought, you know, some really good discussion happened, and I'm glad that you were able to talk with me about Soul of an Indian.
Well, thank you for having me. Pidamaya.
Yep, Pidamian. Dokshta, my relative, until I see you again.
Dokstake.